Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a wonderful Thursday afternoon. Thank you again for joining us for another edition of the Tom's Hardware Show. This week, we're talking about AMD's new Radeon 6500 XT GPU. We have our reviewer, Jared Walton, on with that. And we also have managing editor Paul Alcorn on to discuss just the sort of general budget GPU market. Before we get into that, let's roll the thing. Paul, Jared, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. Busy times.
Good. So, Jared, you reviewed the Radeon RX 6500 XT for us, and this is not just AMD's first budget GPU, but like the first true budget GPU in like 2 years, Jared, right?
Yes, like we haven't seen an official budget GPU launch probably since, you could say RX 5500. I guess at some point they did do the Radeon 5300 and 5400. I never actually reviewed those. Didn't send them to me. They may have been mostly OEM parts anyway. NVIDIA's side, you had the GTX 1650 Super. And after that, they haven't really done any major launches or announcements of budget cards. We've seen things like refreshed, hey, they're selling the 1030 again. Hey, they're selling the 1010. But mostly it's been a while since we've seen a budget GPU. And I don't know if that was intentional or if it was just like, as things got rolling along, why make budget GPUs if you can sell expensive GPUs for a lot of money?
Right. I know recently we did get the 2080 12 gigabyte, correct? I think we talked about that on the show, right?
3080, yeah.
3080. Okay.
It's see the glowing thing behind me? That's the new Alder Lake test bed in a Cooler Master half 500 case. That's a new case from them as well. The MSI Supreme X is in there. It's the 3080 12 gigabyte. Shockingly, so it's not under embargo. I just need to do some testing. New test bed, new test suite. I need comparison cards tested as well. But so far, you'll be amazed to know that it's a little bit slower than the 3080 Ti.
Wow, shocking.
Yeah.
So it was the 2060 12 gigabyte is what I was thinking about. And that was another attempt to like re-release an older card to hit this lower segment of the market. But would you call that truly budget?
No, that's like calling the upcoming 3050 budget. I'm like $250 MSRP. That's mainstream. Paul and I have talked about this too. Like we see it on motherboards as well, where, people sometimes go, oh, well, this is a budget Z690. And I'm like, no, it's not a budget. It's a Z690 that's the least expensive, but that's not the same thing.
Yeah. Times, things are becoming more expensive, but,
it makes this interesting because this GPU on paper, and of course it's always on paper with these things, is coming in at less than $200, right?
Well, $199, yeah.
So almost 200 exactly.
But the big thing is what its predecessor came to market at.
Yeah, so this is the thing. It ostensibly replaces the RX 5500 XT, right? Like it's the 500 XT card, right? The 5500 XT was available in both 4 gigabyte and 8 gigabyte versions, and AMD even had a blog post at the time saying gaming beyond 4 gigabyte and basically lambasting 4 gigabyte cards as being insufficient for gaming. And that's like 2 years ago. And the reason they did that was because they had an 8 gigabyte 5500 XT and NVIDIA had a 4 gigabyte 1650 Super.
And now we have a 4 gigabyte 5600 XT.
6500.
6500. I knew I was mixing those up. Apologies.
The previous gen with 8 gigabytes was how much at launch?
It launched at $199, and that 4 gigabyte card was $179, I believe.
Yeah. So price up, card down.
And what's even worse is, so this is supposed to be the replacement, and in a lot of the benchmarks, which we'll get to in a bit, it's slower than the 5500 XT. Like it's tied with the 4 gigabyte card and slower than the 8 gigabyte card, and it's like, that's not the right way. And my take is AMD probably, and they've even said this now too. They've said, oh, well, this was designed as an entry-level laptop GPU for, maybe even pair it with a Rembrandt Ryzen 6000 processor that has, funny enough, an RDNA 2 GPU that has like 12 CUs. It's a bit slower, meaning Rembrandt would be a bit slower, but Rembrandt has video codec stuff. And it has more display outputs. And so it's like, if it were paired with a laptop, then some of the missing features don't matter as much. But still, you end up with this chip where you're like, okay, it's 107 millimeters square. That's a super tiny GPU. And most likely it was meant to be their entry level ultra budget offering. So probably more like the 6300. Replacing the 5300, and then it's like a step up. It's still got a 64-bit memory bus. You could argue back and forth about what AMD initially intended, but they're launching it and claiming it as a budget GPU when the reality is it's like a budget GPU from 2 years ago. That's how it performs.
Right. So that was going to be the next big thing I was going to get into is this GPU, it supposedly fits a nice niche, but it's getting panned a decent amount, not just from us, but from other reviewers. And a lot of that has to do with its performance, especially like Paul said, compared to the last gen GPU. So before we get into showing off the benchmark charts, any general notes you want to share with us, Jared?
Even when they launched it, I kind of looked at the specs and I was like, oh, that's going to be kind of bad. Because they cut the memory bus width down to 64 bits. And like 64-bit buses are what you get on cards like the GT 1030 and the Radeon 530. Like they're not even marketed as gaming graphics cards. They're just like, this is the ultra budget. And yes, they can run Counter-Strike Global Offensive. I had someone like telling me these things can run CSGO. I'm like, everything can run CSGO. Yeah, like Intel integrated graphics can, right? But yeah, so it's like they're not super fast. But it's like, well, AMD did this thing with the Infinity Cache where they're like, we don't need as big of a bus. And so, the high end had a 256-bit bus on the Navi 21, and then you went down to 192-bit on the 6700 XT, then 128-bit on the 6600 XT. And when I saw that, I was like, well, gosh, what are they going to do on the budget? And then they announced a 64-bit, and I was like, really? Like, you couldn't even do 96-bit? Like, that would have helped a lot. 6 gigabytes of RAM on a 96-bit bus would have fixed a lot of issues. And people would say, yeah, but then it could mine. And I just kind of shake my head and say, no sensible miner should be bothering with cards like this. Like, there's economies of scale, and it's like, you can only put typically 8 GPUs on a mining rig. And even that requires some finagling and, risers, and all of that stuff adds cost. And your PC has a cost. And so it's like, well, would you rather run 8 6600 XT or, even 6900 XT, RTX 3080s, all these higher end cards that are doing 30, 60, 90 mega hash? Or would you like this 6500 XT, and hypothetically, if it had the wider bus, it would do like 20 mega hash. I'm like, so you could have 8 of those that would equal less than 2 3080s. And it's like, it just doesn't scale that well. And I'm like, yeah, I'm sure someone's going to mine on it or would have mined on it, but I just don't think it's like that big of a deal. People are still buying the 1650 Super too.
That kind of answers a viewer question we already got, which is like, have you tried to mine on the card? And what if making the bandwidth so low is the solution to the graphics card stock? I do want to remind everyone that we are taking viewer questions throughout the show. So if you want to leave them in whatever comment box you have down below, we'll look at them. But like, I have 2 responses to that. Number one being like, a miner would probably want a better card, and number 2 being like, if the solution to the graphics card stock is to make the cards so bad that even miners don't want them, I don't know if that really achieves anything.
Yeah, guess what? Gamers don't want them either at that point, right?
I know you were. I wanted to get into the benchmark charts, but this leads so naturally into this. I know you were looking at what the aftermarket sales for this thing are like earlier today, and even there's not a lot of entries, right?
Yeah, well, and it's so new that you wonder. I suspect scalpers and such that are trying to milk eBay for all it's worth, or eBay buyers, they probably wanted to see the reviews. And now that the reviews are out and they're pretty negative, or at least not great, it's like, well, so it's a $200 card. How much can you reasonably scalp it for? Maybe 300. And at that point, it's like, well, you're buying the card, you're running a risk, it's slow performance, not even miners are going to really want it. It all kind of piles up. So I looked on eBay earlier today and there were 3 sales, average price of $373. That's not good. And there were like 9 listings, including, I think someone spotted that one of them was an empty box, no GPU included,
Of
so
course.
the same old garbage that you see on eBay, with scams and such. So I tell people, like, don't buy on eBay if you can avoid it, or at least, if you go that route, really look for someone reputable, like, even go to an Asus or an EVGA or whoever store. A lot of them have stores where they'll sell things too, which is kind of sad, right?
I think the one thing that people have to take into perspective too, when we're looking at, it's so hard to gauge, are they simply not scalping them because the cards aren't available? So look at just to talk CPUs, Ryzen 3300X, probably one of the best quad core $100 CPUs money can buy. But even from the day of launch, those chips were a ghost. The only place you could find them is in OEM systems. So they sell a lot more into OEMs, and this card feels like something that's more tailored for an OEM than retail. So because it is so much low margin, you have to wonder, how committed is AMD to actually delivering these to the market? Are they actually going to make a lot and put them out there? I have a hard time with that.
As a third-party DIY graphics card, I don't think they're going to necessarily make a lot. As an OEM card, as a laptop solution, I think they'll make a lot. And keep in mind, like, the 5500 XT was built on TSMC N7, 7 nanometer. This is TSMC N6, which is really kind of overlaps a lot. It just has a few extra EUV layers. And so, you look at the size and it's like the chip size of the 5500 XT, the Navi 14, was, I'm actually going to look it up. It was 158 millimeters squared. And so they've shrunk that down to 107 millimeters squared. And it's like, well, okay, so they can build like 1.5 of these for every 5500 XT they could have built. I don't know. It's just not super impressive from that standpoint. They stripped things down so far that you kind of go, well, who still wants it? Laptops seems like that's the reasonable guess.
And some OEM desktop that's bound for, a receptionist or, like those types of settings, office setting, low end stuff.
But
or you'll get
those need dedicated GPUs even?
Do what?
Do those even need dedicated GPUs?
Well, I mean, if you're AMD and you're selling a bunch of Ryzen processors without GPUs, perhaps.
Well, why don't we go ahead and look at some of the specs so that we can see how it compares to via numbers to some of these already existing GPUs. So I know, Jared, you tested several games on this against the previous generation card, as well as NVIDIA's lower end GPUs like the 1650 Super and the 1066 gigabyte. So I know, what do you have to share? It seems like the 6500 XT lost out to the previous generation even.
Yes. So, I mean, we can look at the individual charts too, but you can see overall, it basically is tied with the 4 gigabyte 5500 XT, tied with the GTX 1650 Super, which is why AMD's marketing was like comparing it to the 1650. And it's like, oh, come on, the 1650 is kind of a, that was their super slow model that we didn't really like that either. So, and then the 8 gigabyte card, and this is at 1080p medium, and sometimes high. Like I tested Forza Horizon 5 in high settings. Anyway, like even at reduced settings, you have at least a 10% advantage to the 8 gigabyte card of the previous generation that launched with the same price. And so you go, well, that's not a good look. And then like the 1066 gigabyte, I mean, hey, it beat that, right? That's like still the most popular card according to the Steam hardware survey. But then, it came out 5 years ago almost, I think. So that's, again, you kind of go, well, I should hope you could beat a 5-year-old GPU with a new GPU. And it, you could find the 1060 for around $250 for quite a while before the cryptocurrency and pandemic stuff killed the graphics card market, basically, right?
So, I mean, you can see from these specs how it compares to these older cards. I guess the only thing it really has notably on them then is perhaps price. If they can sell it for $200 and it beats, other cards that are selling for $150, maybe it's worth it. How does it compare to the 5500 XT on price, Jared? I know you talked about that a bit in your review.
Right. So looking at eBay prices, because that's kind of if you actually want to get a graphics card right now, you could go to eBay and pay the premium, and they're selling for $315 or thereabouts for the 4 gigabyte cards. The 8 gigabyte cards are like $400. So that's not really anything we could condone buying either. So my thought is, I'm like, performance is going to dictate price rather than MSRP dictating price. And so when you look at it and you say, hey, the 1650 Super, it's as fast as that. And it's like, okay, well, the 1650 Super is selling for $325 on eBay. And so logically, I think these cards are going to gravitate toward that same price range. And I mean, NVIDIA cards have a little bit more of the brand recognition. Mm-hmm. So maybe they have like a 10% premium for the equivalent performance, but still that means $300 is what we'll likely see people paying for the 6500 XT, which is, it's sad, but it's kind of the world we live in.
Right.
Until the pandemic and the supply fixes, it's stuck.
These sticker prices are kind of pipe dreams in a way, but without it, I just don't, this seems like it's just kind of another one on top of the pile to me.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I think it was probably being produced more for laptops. And so they're releasing the desktop version. I mean, nothing's ever truly created only for laptops or only for desktops, really. Especially if it's easy enough to port between them. And so they have the chips and they're like, yeah, let's release a desktop version. And who knows, they can probably, if they sell them at $200 on the, add-in board market, that's probably going to get them more money per chip than the OEMs will pay to stick these in laptops.
Right. The only place where I really see a 1650 these days is in a laptop anyway. And there are a decent amount of those on the low end market, which I guess does, raise the question of why even release a desktop version of this, especially when it's so similar to the previous gen in both performance and realistic price, if not MSRP. I guess it doesn't hurt them to do that, but it makes me question whether budget cards are going to be the solution, to the mining crisis.
Yeah, I think mining is actually tapering off as well. There's a lot of countries that are, fighting against it. I think Russia is now talking about banning cryptocurrency inside its borders as well, just like China and some others have done. It uses a lot of power. It's not green. It's used for nefarious purposes. There's a lot of dark web stuff that uses cryptocurrency. And that's all driven the price of cryptocurrency down, which means mining is less profitable. And then you have Ethereum is still looking at switching to proof of stake. So when that happens, mining Ethereum, 2 years, 3 years, but no, really this time, let's hope they do. But if they switch to proof of stake and you can't mine Ethereum, how much can you make using GPUs to mine other cryptocurrencies, especially considering like Ethereum's profitability and worth and all that is probably I don't know, like 90 something percent higher, 90 times the market of all the other small cryptocurrencies combined. So I don't think you can have all these huge mining firms go over to, what are some of the, I'm drawing a blank now. Anyway, these other coins that use alternative algorithms. I don't think they would absorb it.
There's an insane number of cryptocurrencies. So.
Yeah,
I mean, they can just start them and hope it takes off.
Yeah, but
they don't.
The ones they start aren't necessarily profitable. So
right.
It's like, what are you going to do? Mine Doge?
Over 8,000 according to a fast Google. So so someone can rise to the top. Who will be the next?
Well, there's that take too. Like, so all these miners will push for some cryptocurrency to become the next Ethereum.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a done deal by any means, but cryptocurrencies have been cyclical. So the fact that they're going down,
it's like a bubble that pops up again every 10 years or so, and I'm hoping we're reaching
only
the end
3.
of the cycle this time. Really?
Yeah, not every 10 years.
Three or so years. 2017, 2020.
Each time the peak goes higher.
Yeah. And that's what people keep on hoping, I missed the last one, but if I get in now, I mean, it can't keep doing that forever. Nothing can. It always has to. So don't get caught holding the bag. Anyway, let's go back to performance. So you can see this is your overall medium. You want to flip through the other 1080p medium charts, and we'll just quickly look at them. So this is new test suite. Some of the games are a little older, some are newer. Borderlands 3, it's been out for a couple years now. AMD promoted game, again, 8 gigabyte, 5500 XT, easily eclipses everything else. Even the 4 gigabyte, 5500 XT easily beat the 6500 XT. And being an AMD title, the 1650 Super didn't do quite as well. 1066 gigabyte, so on down the list. Next one, we've got Far Cry 6. This is a recent AMD promoted game, and I disabled HD textures for the medium testing. Still, the 8 gigabyte card came out the fastest. The 5500 and 6500 with 4 gigabytes tied. 1650 Super a little bit behind those, and on down the list. Flight Simulator, not promoted by AMD or NVIDIA. So, kind of an agnostic title. NVIDIA's 1650 Super rises above the 6500 and both 5500 cards it rises above both 5500 cards. 6500 XT came out on top, which is kind of interesting. I guess the combination of Infinity Cache and having 4 gigabytes, I guess it was enough to run Flight Simulator at medium settings and do quite well. Older architectures struggle a little bit. You see the 1060 and 570 aren't doing super hot there. And this is running it's the beta, I guess, DX12. So all of the games I tested using low-level APIs, mostly because that's what I'm going to be doing on the higher-end cards, so I don't want to try and mix and match APIs. Okay, let's go back to Forza Horizon 5. This one is, again, I believe agnostic. I don't think AMD or NVIDIA are actively promoting it. And 8 gigabyte card, top of the stack, 1650 Super, a little bit ahead of the 4 gigabyte 5500, which in turn came out ahead of the 6500 XT. It's like, that's the thing that really kills me, is how many times the 5500 XT 4 gigabyte beats the newcomer, and that's probably because it had a 128-bit memory interface. So let's see, Horizon Zero Dawn, originally a console game back in 2017, still uses DX12. Again, the 5500 did really well on this. 1650 Super beats the 6500, and even the 1060 wasn't far behind. That's using original quality, so that's like the PlayStation 4 original quality, not the PlayStation 4 Pro. 2 more games, I think. Red Dead Redemption 2.
And Watchdogs Legion.
Yeah, so Red Dead Redemption, the sole Vulcan representative, and It's at 1080p medium, and this is, so I put all of the settings, all of the advanced settings are set to their absolute minimum, and then I go through the standard settings and set them all to medium. That's the settings I tested at. That's how you keep things consistent across all the cards. And you can see, the 8 gigabyte and 4 gigabyte, not a huge difference this time, and the 6500 XT landed in between them with did I say 6500? Yes. And then the 1650 Super trailing a little bit. So, and then last is this one, Watchdogs Legion, is an NVIDIA promoted game. Shocking that the 1650 Super rises to the top then, right? Still using DX12, so it's a low-level API that often benefits AMD. The 6500 XT came in second this time, so there are cases where it does beat the 8 gigabyte card, not by a lot. So that's all 1080p medium, and then I also tested at 1080p ultra, and this is kind of where, like, going into it, I knew the 4 gigabyte cards were going to struggle. So like it wasn't like you're supposed to play it at 1080p ultra, but this is just to show, like, as games use more memory, better resolution textures and everything, what happens. And now you'll see, like, the 1650 Super still comes in just a hair above the 6500 XT, but the 5500 XT 8 gigabyte card now, it's like 25% faster instead of 10% faster. And that's kind of what you're going to be dealing with.
You mentioned it earlier, but what's really getting me is that the 4 gigabyte last gen version is consistently beating the current gen also 4 gigabyte card.
Yeah, and again, like, I think it's because Infinity Cache can help, but it's only 16 megabits, so it can't help that much. Like, the smaller your cache, the less data it can hold, the more likely you are to have things that got evicted from the cache that you need to pull back into the cache. And so that memory bandwidth then becomes important.
Mm-hmm. And it's possible that, this might hold some kind of niche use for some people, but that naming scheme has got to be confusing for the average person. You'd expect this to do better than the previous version.
Yeah, it's like, imagine buying the new, 911 Porsche and it's worse, provably worse than the previous year Porsche.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what we're getting.
Right.
It uses less power.
So if we move on to specific games then.
Yeah. So again, Borderlands 3, especially at the badass settings, go Gearbox with that naming. It's now getting to be a bigger gap. And one of the things I've noticed over time is, like, even though both the 1650 Super and the 6500 XT and the 5500 XT all have 4 gigabytes, that 64-bit versus 128-bit bus plays a role, and NVIDIA often does a little better with memory management. I mean, Borderlands 3 is an AMD promoted game, so the 5500 XT came out ahead of the 1650 Super, but there will be more games where that flips a little bit. But and you can see the 1066 gigabyte is now nipping at the heels of the 6500 XT as well.
It's interesting. We have a viewer comment here because I noticed you put the RX 570 in these comparisons as well. And we have Jeff Phillips here saying he wished they called it the RX 570 V2.0.
Well, it wasn't V2.0. It was the 470 V2.0.
Is it
right?
even worth being a 6000 series card?
Yeah, I mean, it is the hardware. It's got RDNA 2 architecture, but it's not, like, it's pretty much as low as you can go with RDNA 2 and still be RDNA 2. I mean, 16 compute units is not a lot. And the Rembrandt APU, Paul's going to be champing at the bit to get that one and test it in the coming months, but that will have 12 CUs, which is the same as the OEM only Radeon RX 6400.
It just feels a little misleading to me. I don't know. It feels like at this point, when you get so low, you might as well be using integrated graphics in a lot of these use cases. But let's continue on through the games then.
Far Cry 6, this one, especially with the HD textures, really, really punished the 4 gigabyte cards. And I was talking in our forums with someone about this. Like, this is the best case scenario on performance testing. The 4 gigabyte cards behaved really weird, poorly. at these higher settings, where sometimes I'd get a run that was like 10 frames per second. And that applies not just to the 6500 XT, but to the 5500 XT and the 1650 and 1650 Super. I mean, you can see even the 1650 Super, I probably need to go and retest that a couple times, but I would get some runs that were really low, and then like every other run would be really high, and it was just kind of this weird thing. And because eventually this all goes into our GPU hierarchy, I'm like, well, where do you standardize? Like, no one's going to play at 10 frames per second, so presumably if you just have to restart the game or relaunch it or exit to the menu and restart it, you would do that if the performance was really bad. So it was far more variable under Far Cry 6. Like that was, I think it's because of the DirectX 12 API. It's a low-level API. The developers of the games have to do more of the garbage collection and memory management. And what that means is if they don't do it well, and a lot of them kind of like to have 6 gigabyte or 8 gigabyte of VRAM to work with, then strange things can happen. So anyway, 8 gigabyte card definitely helped there. Flight Simulator still actually like the 6500 XT. That's like the one shining spot for AMD's newcomer. And I'm still not sure quite why that is. Like, is it something about the way the texturing works? I don't know.
Maybe Microsoft will buy AMD next.
Yeah, that'd be something. That would be something.
That would be something. For those who are unaware, Microsoft recently just bought Activision Blizzard, and it's been a huge shakeup to the gaming space. But it's they don't own AMD at all. It's just a joke.
They do use AMD's chips in their console.
They do, yes.
So let's see. Flight simulators. What have we got next? Forza Horizon 5.
Another Microsoft game.
Yep, and again here you see like the 8 gigabyte cards really benefit a lot. Here even the 1650 Super and the 1066 gig came out ahead of the other AMD cards. Interestingly, the 574 gigabyte also did better here, and that's probably because it's got a 16 width, a by 16 PCI Express slot, plus it's got a 256-bit memory interface, even though it's only GDDR5, so it still has a lot of memory bandwidth.
We're still really splitting hairs, though. This is coming in below 30 FPS now, which is our minimum for what.
Yeah, it's not an awesome gaming experience. That's for sure.
Granted, this is on extreme, which does. I know we have more charts to look at, but this user has been waiting for a bit. What about the super low end space with this? Is this worth buying for PCIe 3.0, playing in 900p all low settings?
900p all low, it's probably going to be okay. What I found is, so I did test PCI Express. I used a 9900K, so it is a different CPU, different platform, but a mature one. And I tested the 6500 XT on both the new and old platforms. I did the same for the 1650 Super. The 1650 Super actually ran a little bit faster on the 9900K. And again, it has the full X16 PCI Express connection. The 6500 XT was 8% slower on average than the on the 9900K versus the 12900K, which is pretty significant considering like we should be fully GPU bottlenecked even at these settings on a 9900K, but because of the PCI Express width, it hurt performance. And I think it was Borderlands 3 was like, even at the medium preset, was 25% slower on PCIe Gen 3 than on Gen 4. And it's a problem because this is a budget card, which will probably go into budget systems that might not have PCI Express Gen 4.
Mm-hmm.
So
if we continue with the games.
Horizon Zero Dawn, you can see the results there. 5500 XT coming out ahead once more.
We're back above. We're almost at 60 FPS, which is
not as demanding of a game. So I like a good mix of games, and it's nice to see at least one game at maximum settings getting close to 60.
So, I mean, this was originally a PS4 game, which uses hardware that's quite old at this point. So,
Yeah, the original PS4 is roughly equivalent to an RX 560. I mean, there's differences and such, but it's like 10
like
compute units or
companies can usually squeeze a bit more out of it just because it's dedicated specifically for gaming, and
Yeah.
every PS4 is running the same thing. But
And the PS4 Pro is basically your 570 or 580 type of hardware.
Mhm.
Red Dead Redemption. Now, this one, you can't actually use the ultra settings across everything in the game itself, but if you hack the system XML file for the game, you can set ultra settings on the textures and reflections, which takes it above 4 gigabytes, and it still ran, but it doesn't run awesomely.
And then finally, Watchdogs Legion. We
Yep.
again have a below 30 FPS.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an NVIDIA marketed game, right?
Yeah, the interesting thing here is like the 1650 Super, maybe I could retest that a few more times and see if that's really always that bad. But, the 1060, obviously having that extra 2 gigabytes of memory makes a big difference there in Watchdogs Legion. So
I'm just curious seeing, I'm also a PS4 game, but still fairly demanding when we tested on PCs. I'm curious seeing RDR2, wow, I said it by the initials. I'm curious seeing Red Dead Redemption beat out Watch Dogs on performance.
Yeah, I mean, it's different engines, lots of stuff, but Vulkan, I don't think Vulkan API gets enough credit. Like, I mean, Wolfenstein Youngblood uses Vulkan, the Doom Eternal, the Doom games, those use the Vulkan API. And when it's properly optimized, it always seems like Vulkan does better across the board than DirectX 12. Like I've tested Red Dead Redemption in DX12 mode, and it's usually slower on any chosen GPU. So, but for better or worse, DirectX 12 usually wins out.
Great. So if we move away from like the nitty gritty specs for a little bit and talk bigger picture, you have it to show. Never mind.
I do have the card. Let me also talk a little bit about the card. So FXX, XFX. It's hard to say that fast sometimes.
I don't like it.
Yeah. So it has a single 6-pin power connector, which that makes sense. It's 107 watt. This is factory overclocked, so I think it's technically a 120 watt board power. Board power meaning not just the GPU, it's GPU memory and other circuitry. You can't probably see it, but if you were to look close, you would see that there's connections to the first quarter of the long slot down here, and that's how you know it's an X4 connection. So there's no links going to the last 3 quarters of the long slot. Big fans, 95 millimeter fans, keeps the card cool. It ran at like 56 degrees Celsius. The one thing I did want to point out though, and this is Navi 24 across all the announced products, laptops and desktops, and professional Radeon Pro, there's only 2 display outputs supported. You can use MST multi-stream transport on DisplayPort to run 2 monitors off of a single connection, but they cut corners on everything. So even if the chip itself kind of supported 4 outputs, they didn't put the rest of the physical hardware in there to enable that. So I don't think anyone's going to want to run this with quad displays, probably.
That's what I was thinking is what's the real use case there?
Yeah. So I'm not opposed to 2 ports. The one problem though is like they're an HDMI and a DisplayPort on this card, and it's like, well, ideally you usually want to use the same like dual HDMI or dual DisplayPort, not one of each, but not everyone has a DisplayPort monitor, not everyone has an HDMI monitor, so you end up putting one of each. Anyway, so that's the card.
DVI.
What's that? DVI.
No, DVI is ancient at this point.
Paul still misses the D sub VGA connector.
Yeah.
My last monitor, I was actually working with a DVI to HDMI adapter.
Yeah.
I used one of those before.
Yeah, I've used them before for sure.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So anyway, I know I said during the charts, that this is so low RDNA 2, why don't you use integrated graphics instead? And I'm not just trying to, talk out my butt there a little bit. It's just because the new AMD laptop CPUs are coming out with RDNA 2 integrated graphics, right? So, this is a desktop GPU, but like we said, we were thinking it'll probably work best in the laptop space. So, what is the use case for this? Should you buy it now, even if you're a low-end gamer who's been stuck on Intel integrated graphics for a bit? Or should you wait for other options, even for the 3050 coming down the line, which will be more expensive, but, probably more performant as well?
Yeah, I mean, like when you look at the specs of the 3050, for $50 more MSRP, I mean, NVIDIA is not known for being charitable and pricing things really that low. So it was kind of interesting, but at the same time, they announced a $329 MSRP for the 3060 12 gigabyte. So, maybe they went down from there. Anyway, I think the 3050 is probably going to end up selling for $400 to $500 on the street, just because it's going to be a faster, more capable card,
It's
and
like
it can mine.
$100 more than this.
Yeah.
Entry level mining card, unfortunately.
Yeah, I hope people don't try and buy these for mining, but they probably will. But yeah, I mean, the 3050 has 8 gigabyte. I've noticed with the 2060 over the past couple of years, like technically it can do ray tracing, but because it has 6 gigabytes of memory, it sometimes struggles. We didn't show ray tracing performance for the 6500 XT. Like it's really bad. You have to be very careful of what you enable, and in order to get ray tracing to run at acceptable performance, you usually end up with ray traced settings that don't do a lot for visuals. And so you kind of go, well, gosh, why am I taking the performance hit for something that doesn't look any better? But Cyberpunk 2077, Minecraft, Control didn't run. Control didn't like the card probably because it had 4 gig. It wouldn't even let me.
Both DirectX versions of it?
Well, you can't do ray tracing with DX11.
Okay.
So I used DX12 and I was like, it just said, you need a DXR capable card to enable ray tracing. I'm like, this is one. But yeah, so Fortnite crashed when I tried to enable medium reflections. And if you test Fortnite out on an RTX or RX 6000 card, that doesn't crash, and turn on low reflections, DXR reflections, they suck. They don't actually, like, I'm like, is anything being done, or is this just like placebo? Medium, the reflections make a difference, like when you look in a window on a building. And so that's what I wanted to test at, and I couldn't on the 6500 XT. But like, yeah, a bunch of the games that I tested with ray tracing enabled got single digit performance, even with like medium settings and medium ray tracing. So it's more of a feature checklist, and maybe professional cards will benefit from having ray tracing hardware where it's not supposed to be real-time ray tracing, where it's like, no, we're doing 3D rendering stuff for a professional app, and having it do it faster on the GPU, even if it's not as fast as like a 6800 XT, it will be beneficial.
Okay. Going back to Control a bit, because I think I did misunderstand a little bit. Will that run without ray tracing at least?
Yes.
Okay. So you don't have games that are just being locked out to you on this card.
Right. Yeah, you could try them, and I would suspect that Control at medium or even high settings without ray tracing will probably run okay. I don't think that one was quite as memory intensive when you didn't use ray tracing. I know. I have a creature in the background. I don't know. That's my 11-year-old. He is home from school today because his class is under quarantine.
Oh, I mean, does he like Minecraft RTX with this?
Corbin, do you like Minecraft RTX?
Or I guess RTX wouldn't.
He does like it. He has played that quite a bit.
I guess RTX wouldn't run on a. I don't know why I brought up with an AMD card. Can you do AMD?
No, you can
ray
do
tracing with AMD cards in Minecraft.
Yes.
Why is
And
it
I
called
tested that.
Minecraft RTX then?
Well, because NVIDIA paid.
Okay.
Go be the money. And it supports DLSS.
It is a lower end game though, so that is a potential use case for a card.
Well, except the ray tracing is full path tracing. So like it's basically as complex as you can make ray tracing. And so the net result was at 1080p because there's no DLSS to try and make things a little less painful. Minecraft ran at 13.5 frames per second on the 6500 XT.
My son plays it in the Minecraft RTX. Is flipping that switch. That's a big first step.
Okay.
Right?
I have to hear about all this secondhand because I haven't opened Minecraft since undergrad, but
it's probably for the best.
Yeah. So overclocking on this card, Jared, did you try it? Can it do it? I assume not very well.
I didn't try it. So one thing, this does have high clock speeds at stock on this XFX card. It ran at 2711 megahertz during my Metro Exodus test that I use for power and other stuff, power and clock speed measurements. I would suspect, and if you look at the chart, it's like a flat line at 2711. It doesn't even fluctuate. It's just pegged, and I assume that's like whatever the theoretical maximum turbo boost on the chip or boost clock is 2.8. I think it's 2815 at reference, and the XFX card is supposed to be like 2835 or 2845. If I lift the power limit and overclock it, I wouldn't be surprised if it gets close to 3 gigahertz, but it's kind of one of those things where it's like, yeah, I guess that's like overclocking a single core chip really high. So a
lot of our benchmarks looked at single player games, but I know you said you tested it anecdotally, at least in Fortnite for a bit. And that is sort of the sweet spot for a lot of these lower end cards, is to run these esports titles that try to run on as many machines as possible because they want a wide player base. How did it handle Fortnite?
Well, I used the ray tracing in Fortnite. That's one of my ray tracing tests. So I don't recall exactly what it got without ray tracing, but I do know with ray tracing, and this was on the low settings for ray tracing, which, as I said, didn't seem to look that good, but it got like 40 frames per second. Turn off ray tracing completely, run at medium quality. I would suspect you're at least getting 100 frames per second. Whether it's a steady above 120, I couldn't say without doing like an actual quick test. And some of that might depend on your CPU a little bit too. I mean, Fortnite's pretty light. So yeah, League of Legends, that's another one that runs on Intel integrated graphics reasonably okay. So I would suspect 120 frames per second isn't going to be a problem in LOL.
Great. Wow, I don't think I've ever heard anyone call it LOL before.
I like calling it that because it makes me laugh.
Okay, so we do have a question from a show regular. We talked about this a bit earlier, but we have more viewers now. I heard these are overclocked mobile chips. So again, these were originally meant for the laptop market, right?
That's what AMD, one of their people, said in the Foronics forums. That was posted like yesterday, I guess, or maybe early today. But yeah, it makes sense because the lowest end dedicated GPUs do tend to be used more in laptops because Dell and HP and whoever, they sometimes like having the opportunity to say, as a dedicated graphics card, even if the dedicated graphics card is crap, they can still say it. So.
Right, which again, like I said, we're going to get, this is very low-end RDNA 2. We're going to get low-end RDNA 2.
Hey, we're going to get it in smartphones, so, I mean,
right.
It's got twice as many compute units as the Samsung.
Which is why I said, question, does this deserve to be 6000 series? Sure, it uses the same tech, but we have other RDNA 2 things coming out that aren't labeled 6000 series.
Yeah, but they won't be sold as a
dedicated GPU.
Yeah.
So I guess that leads to the next question. Even in the stock restricted GPU space we're in right now. Do budget cards have a space? Is this one just a dud? Maybe the future attempts will work out. I don't know.
I think long term, at some point, the market corrects and mining isn't a huge factor for a while again, and supply catches up to demand, and all of that stuff happens. And at that point, I'm like, if this were a normal market today, I think this would have probably been like $100 to $120 graphics card. It would have been their extreme budget, and then it probably would have been called the Radeon 6300 and not had the RX, just like the 5300. And then there would have been like an intermediate Radeon 6500 XT that would have had 6 gigabytes of memory and a 96-bit bus, and would have landed between the 6600 and the ultra budget stuff. It would have probably just been a trimmed down Navi 23 core instead of a Navi 24. But when the whole market is messed up, the supply chain's messed up, the mining messes up GPU demand, all of that, then I feel like they rebadged it and said, no, let's call this the 6500 XT, even though it's not really faster than a 5500 XT.
Right. On one hand, I like budget cards. I like PC building being accessible to people, but I don't think they're always named in the most honest of way. And I definitely don't think there's the solution to low stock is like, oh, well, let's make a card that's so bad that maybe it'll be in stock,
Yeah, you can buy the GT 1030 for like $120. Maybe it's more than that now, but we picked one up last summer for that, so that I could test it against Intel's Xe DG1, which, hey, there's another car that's really slow and kind of sucks, and you can buy. Actually, you can only buy it with a complete system.
So upcoming competitors, we have Rurutu M saying, save us, Intel Arc.
Yeah, so, I mean, Intel hasn't released the full specs of Arc, but I think we've kind of, I'm assuming it's a 128-bit memory interface on the low-end model. Maybe it's 96-bit, but, something more than 64-bit, and it might end up being, a faster chip than the 6500 XT. We'll have to wait and see. We'll have to wait and see how much it costs. Intel's got an advantage in that it is a completely new GPU architecture, so probably none of the mining software will run off the bat. It will all have to be updated and coded to work with Intel's GPU, so miners hopefully won't snap those up. But
I mean, the thing about mining, though, Jared, Paul, both, I'm curious what you both think about this. It's just like, I wonder how much of the low stock situation we're in right now is pushed by mining at this point, and then how much is pushed by speculation and the historic idea that these cards sell a lot. So I'm going to buy one at launch so I can sell it again later.
Well, there's all that. Plus, there's also just the, everything is kind of in demand. The consoles are in demand. We know that most of AMD's wafers from TSMC are likely going into the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, Xbox Series S, because those are selling millions,
Those are both also in low stock, despite not being very useful for mining.
Yeah, lots of people want them.
I mean, there's problems that are even bigger than that. The shortage of PMICs, which is on essentially, they're power management ICs. They're the small little tiny chips that you see spread all over your motherboards, and everything from your phone to your microwave to your PC. Those are in a big time shortage. So when GPU vendors sell the GPU to an OEM like XFX, they don't sell just the GPU. They also sell VRAM sometimes with it in a kit. And now, from reports, they're also selling PMICs because they're so hard to get that the OEMs can't get them, and they're very expensive. So AMD and NVIDIA are having to leverage their heft. Like AMD, if it's buying for XFX, Gigabyte, Asus, they can buy more of these tiny chips and get them at a more reasonable price than just XFX has no purchasing power. Well,
right.
Not anything on the scale. So, there are so many different factors there. It's just everything.
They can keep making new SKUs. They can lower prices. They can try to, save this on the marketing end. But I think, unless they fix the central supply issue, we're going to keep seeing these problems.
And then you have historic demand. where everybody is complaining about shortages, rightly so. But when you look at the desktop PC market, it did better last year than it has in the past decade, and not by a little bit, by a lot. So, while there are constant shortages, there's just also incredible demand. You have a confluence of all of these factors. It's terrible. The situation isn't easy.
We do have a comment Chinese New Year next week. I didn't realize that we were getting up on that point. I would hope that it won't be as bad as the initial, COVID problems where it started striking during Chinese New Year. I would hope several years in that people are prepared for it. But
Chinese New Year happens every year. They shut down for 10 days every year. They plan for these things.
Right.
So assuming that everything is fine, that's it, which is a big assumption in these days. You shouldn't see any interruption to supply. Now we see slow news during that time and slow responses from companies and things like that. But I mean, in terms of supply, typically it doesn't.
Right.
But these are different times.
So we are reaching time here. Any final thoughts on the 6500 XT before we close out the show?
I mean, there's a lot of divisive opinions on it. Like, some people think that I was too hard on the card in our review. Others were like, how could you give this thing a 3-star? Like, what would it take to get a 1-star? I'm like, well, I look at it as a percentage. I'm like, yeah, it's a 60%. Like, it's still passing, but barely. It kind of comes down to price. At $200 in today's market, this is still going to sell. At $250, it becomes a little more questionable. If it were a normal market, it would be $120, and I still wouldn't like it. And I'd say, hey, people should get the $200 card that's twice as fast. But we're in such a screwed up market that that's not an option. If you need a graphics card, any graphics card, and your choice is a brand new 6500 XT or a used 1060 that might have been beaten up for the past 5.5 years, I would not get the 1060. Like, I would totally not trust buying used cards that are, that have been around for more than 2 years. Even 2 years old, you could probably get away with it. Maybe you'll get an okay card, but it's going to come down to price. So if you find one for $199 and you need a card, sure, go ahead and get it. It's not the worst card ever, right? It's just like, don't expect it to do more than it can do. Know that there are limitations going in, and you're buying at the bottom of the market, so games get more and more complex as time goes on. You'll need to upgrade sooner than later.
This card has an expiration date.
Yeah, but it still works. It's like, it's not significantly worse than a 1650 Super or even the RX 5500 XT 4GB card. So it's like, if those are your choices, one of those 3 cards, buy whichever is cheapest.
I certainly don't envy you on these reviews. I know every first paragraph of these recent reviews is like filled with, well, it says it costs this much, and it's difficult, I'm sure, to deal with writing with.
Yeah, and you hear things like AMD and NVIDIA will both say, oh, we've got a lot of supply for this launch. They didn't actually say that for the 6500 XT. They did on the 6600 XT, but I know NVIDIA told me last year at one point, they said, well, we've launched the 3050 and the 3050 Ti for laptops because we can supply those, but we don't feel like we can make enough chips right now to meet the demand that there would be for a desktop 3050. So they're launching a desktop 3050 next week. Maybe they've got hundreds of thousands of them stocked up. I suspect probably not. I suspect they're going to sell out just like everything else. Yeah, it's a tough time to try and find a graphics card. Hopefully, if you're a PC gamer, anything you bought within the last 5 years that was on the mid-range or high-end level, it still should be serviceable. If you bought a 1070 back in 2016, like, that's not a terrible graphics card. It still runs any game out there. It's faster than the 6500 XT for sure. So, lower your settings and hang on a little while. Yeah.
I mean, my thought on it is I was thinking of an alternative headline. I have two thoughts. Number one is alternative headline would be how desperate are you?
Yeah.
We had the
Yeah.
budget. And the second one is, but my other just general thought is provided it doesn't burn down your house. Typically, there's for the vast majority of folks, there is no bad product, just bad price. So it kind of depends on the price. What can you actually get it at? It's so hard to say these days. Is it worth it?
Yeah, so I'll be looking at pricing when I update my GPU prices article at the start of February, and we'll see how much these are selling for on eBay and how many have sold. I can say, like, traditionally, if you go and look at the article right now, NVIDIA is selling a hell of a lot more RTX 30 series cards than AMD is selling RX 6000 series. Like, even though eBay is not like the whole market at all, like it probably tracks pretty well with the overall market, because you say, people who buy these cards for scalping purposes, they're probably doing it at the same rate, whether it's AMD or NVIDIA.
So before we end the show, I do have one user comment I just want to point out because it made me laugh. Could they call it the stopgap edition? We often see these cards coming out with SE special edition, but
that's what the SE means, right?
Yeah, special edition. Well, on that note, thank you again for joining us, Jared. I know you've been with us a few weeks lately, and I will be calling on you in the future, likely as more of these cards come out. So I appreciate your service.
We still have the RTX 3090 Ti. I love it's the Ti, the 3090.
You're a TIE fighter.
3090 Ti is supposed to come out. Don't know when that's actually happening, but we've got the 3050, and I've still got an MSI 3080 12 gigabyte to get reviewed. So, fast cards that no one can buy.
Right. And Paul, thank you for joining us as well and providing your excellent insight on supply chains as always. On that note, we will see you again next Thursday at 3 p.m. Have a great week, everyone. Bye.